Welcome to the DawgNation Happy Hour, presented by Marlowe's Tavern. A fun and laid-back look at everything happening around the Georgia Bulldogs and the latest UGA recruiting news there as well. Make sure you stop by the local Marlowe's Tavern right there in your neighborhood and enjoy Happy Hour every weekday from 4 to 6 p.m. And now, for DawgNation Happy Hour, here's your host, Kaylee Mansell.
Hello, DawgNation, and welcome to another episode of the DawgNation Happy Hour, brought to you by our friends at Marlowe's Tavern. As always, I am your self-acclaimed happy hour expert, and not often do we see the same two people come on in consecutive weeks, but I just had too much of a good time last week with Mike Griffith and Jeff Sentell that I wanted to have them back on today. I mean, look at those two. How could you not love those faces right there? We have total opposite backgrounds. Jeff once again decided to go with the questionable ocean, but he's got the Hawaiian shirt to match it, and I think this is the most casual that I've ever seen Mike Griffith. He might be getting ready to head out to a happy hour here soon. So, gentlemen, thank you for coming on this week. Excited to see you both again. As always, we are going to start with our question of the week. And the big topic going on in the state of Georgia right now, aside from UGA football, is that the GHSA did approve this week that we will allow NIL in high school. And that kind of got me thinking about NIL in general. And, gentlemen, I want to turn it to you both, starting with Jeff. What collegiate athlete do we think missed the mark with NIL? Like, who would have been the big NIL athlete if it would have been a thing during their time in college? Jeff?
Good question. As much as I would like to think the goal line stalker would be the guy, I think the name that kind of comes to mind front and center, you probably would look at a guy like Reggie Bush. You would probably look at a guy like Johnny Manziel. Kind of guys that sweep the whole nation, create a movement, hit some iconic status. I mean, there's a lot of good guesses. I'm sure Mike will have 2 or 3 names that we'll all be nodding our heads about. But I think those players that sit there and go, not only is he a good player, but he inspires like a cult following where people would just really feel cool to wear the jersey. I think those guys, and I know Dog fans are sitting there saying, Jeff, say AJ Green. Jeff, say Todd Gurley, because that's what Mark Rick said this week. But I'd go with those guys. Those would be my picks.
Mike, I know you've got some good ones for this.
Peyton Manning, Tim Tebow. I mean, I think those are quarterback-friendly names. Certainly, Manning a legend, his father a legend, his brother, Eli. Tebow for sure is a national champion. What Tim means to so many people outside of football, in addition to, his football prowess. And I think he's the SEC rushing touchdowns all-time leader also. I think those type of big name figures are the ones that kind of come to mind first. I think I'm with Jeff. I think, obviously there was a time when, we thought Johnny Manziel was going to be something special. He ended up kind of washing out. As it turned out, wasn't as good as, maybe we thought it in an NFL level. Trying to think if there's anybody else that's really captured. Marcus Mariota was a pretty special guy at Oregon, and with the Nike headquarters there, I imagine that would have been marketed pretty heavily. I'm trying to think of some former Buckeyes. I don't know that Ezekiel Elliott really made it that big. Just going through it in my mind, Kaylee. You don't give us any time for the preparation. I don't know if that's good or bad. If we had more time, we might be ready with more answers. But
now, Mike,
those are the names that jump to mind.
Mike, Tebow, I think he'd be too busy lifting weights and giving speeches to do ads. I mean, that's what I kind of looked at. I thought about him, and you were right on with the Mannings, because the Mannings would basically endorse some roach killer or decon roach spray like Muhammad Ali did back in the days if somebody handed him a contract to go their way. But I think Tebow would probably be all about the business. I was trying to look for a guy that, would probably be up for some extra income on the side when I was kind of thinking of that. But Manning, definitely. And I mean, there's a lot of guys. I mean, probably should have said Michael Jordan, probably should have looked in basketball, probably should have looked at another era.
We're going to talk about that later, so don't worry about that just yet. So for me, I kind of initially thought about what Jeff had said. Johnny Mansell seems like the easiest answer here, but Johnny Mansell wasn't like this huge top 10 5-star recruit coming out of high school. I tried to think about it from a high school and a collegiate standpoint. And we talk about recency bias a lot on this show, but the big one that came to mind for me was Trevor Lawrence, because Trevor Lawrence barely missed the cutoff. I believe it was either the following year or 2 years after he got out of school that NIL became a thing. And I just kept thinking he was the number one player of the country. I don't think it would have swayed his college decision. I think he was going to Clemson from the very beginning. But don't you think that Head and Shoulders wouldn't have jumped on that man within 20 seconds of him graduating from Cartersville High School to supply him with a major NIL deal? I mean, talk about a generational talent that has had eyes on him since he was 14 years old. I truly think that Trevor Lawrence would have been complete NIL gold, and I'm really surprised that neither one of you said that.
Dabo might not let him have NIL.
Maybe.
Well, Dabo's line was that Dabo was all about NIL in God's name, image, and likeness at Clemson. That's how Dabo described Clemson being an NIL program.
And we see how that has turned out for him. So maybe in the future things will change, but it's not looking good for the Tigers right now. All right, let's shift to last week before we start hammering in on the things that could have gone better. Let's talk about the improvements that we've seen from UGA so far, from game 1 against UT Martin to now. Let's talk about the positives. Mike, what is the most drastic improvement that we have seen from this Dogs team?
Well, individually be Peyton Woodring. I mean, this is a guy that missed a 28-yard field goal, I believe, against UT Martin, and he had 2 really clutch, pressure-packed kicks against Auburn. I mean, this is a guy near and dear to Jeff's heart. A lot of questions about Peyton, and Jeff is very, very, very firmly behind this young man,
Yes.
and I feel like Jeff was validated in his opinions, as was Kirby Smart. A lot of people calling for a kicker change because the freshman missed a couple of 28-yard field goals early, and how could you count on this guy? And Kirby trusted what he had seen in practice, and Jeff trusted what he knew from reporting on this young man through recruiting, and lo and behold, so from an individual standpoint, that would be that. I would say that it wasn't much, but you saw that Ladd McConkey made a difference. He had 3 third-down catches. It was his first playing time of the season. I think he made a difference in the offense. I think he made a difference in the game, and hopefully, Ladd's back holds up. But those would be the 2 most marked ones that I would note.
Jeff,
I got to go Carson back. And a lot of that stuff with Peyton is just, I've been covering these guys for a long time. I know when I can take, I know what feels like fool's gold, and I know what feels like gold and the real thing. There's a lot of things in Peyton's background. For him to be able to kick as a freshman at Georgia and earn that was remarkable. Everything he's done in his life has been a competition. Kickers have to have one-day auditions, like the Eminem song, one shot, one opportunity. I know Michael liked that Michigan reference from 8 Mile up there, but like everything a kicker has to do, it's always an audition. It's always, you got one shot, one opportunity, and if you fall, if you're just merely very good, he probably wouldn't have been the Under Armour All-American kicker. He probably wouldn't have went to Georgia. He probably wouldn't have done a lot of things. But the name for me was Carson. I don't know if one of those savvy beat reporters have thought about this yet, but I don't know if we can ever say we've seen a Georgia starter come back from 10 points down in his first 2 SEC starts. I don't know if we've ever seen a Georgia quarterback on his first 2 SEC starts bring the Dogs back from double digits.
Now, Jeff, you realize we can turn this around. I don't know that we've had a Georgia starter that's fallen behind by 10 points in his first 2 SEC because of the slow start. So just playing devil's advocate there. Good.
You're excellent at devil's advocate. Let me be angel's advocate here. Maybe that's what I try to do to lighten things out here a little bit. But, you kind of think first 2 SEC starts, he's down by 10 points in both of them. How about this? This is Kirby. This is not the Kirby thing, but the Tom Brady special. The comebacks. He's led 2 double-digit comebacks in his first 2 SEC starts. That's probably something that sticks out to me, but I think he showed everybody. What was it? All those 8 out of 10 on third downs, all those clutch third downs he made. You got to be pretty good, and it shows what you've turned out to be going through the Georgia system as the backup, getting all those reps against all those future NFL guys on defense, when then you can finally take the field and it's your turn and you can make it work.
It's surprising to me that you two feel like you have very friendly disagreements. Like the whole time that Mike is sitting here disagreeing with Jeff, he's got this big smile on his face. And I feel like if it might be somebody else on the other side of that screen, it would be a different story. But you can kind of just see how, Mike wanted to bring it up, but he kept that smile on his face. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But now that we've talked about the good, let's talk about the ugly. We have to address it. And I never thought I would say these words, but let's give Hugh Freeze some credit here for a second. I think that he saw how poorly Georgia did with rush defense in that first game against UT Martin and really used that to his advantage. I mean, they had, 219 rushing yards, which if history and my stats are correct, that's the first time that Georgia has surrendered 200 rushing yards or more in a game since the 2018 LSU loss. Is our rush defense a major concern? Do we see it potentially get better? And then, Mike, do you think that we'll see more teams try to attack run first on us?
Well, I don't know. I think major is probably strong. I think that it had as much to do with the RPO element that Hugh Freeze brought and the Auburn quarterback's ability to run the ball. I mean, Georgia has had trouble with mobile quarterbacks before. I think that that's just something within the nature of Georgia's base scheme. It's very similar to Alabama's. You think back all the way to Cardale Jones and Ohio State beating beating Alabama. And of course, Kirby was the defensive coordinator back in 2014, led to some changes. I think we knew that there would be a drop off on the defensive line. I think it was imminent. These guys aren't as good as last year's guys. I mean, no offense to anybody playing outside linebacker, but they haven't measured up to Nolan Smith. That's who does. I mean, he was a former number one recruit in the nation and 3-year starter and a team captain. No one's measured up to Jalen Carter, but who in the nation would? I mean, you're talking about the most impactful rookie defensive lineman that the NFL has probably seen in some 20 years. So you've got drop off at those positions, and they're both integral positions in run defense. I think that major, though, strikes me as a bit extreme. I don't think this is something that I don't think Kentucky is going to come into Sanford Stadium and just bulldoze Georgia.
Well, Jeff, from a recruiting standpoint, there were a lot of guys that I saw in the stands at the Auburn game. If you put yourself in the shoes of a recruit, what would have been your takeaways from the game for both teams?
Well, I think it's probably offers a lot of hope for Auburn. They're like, oh, we don't have – you saw a lot of recruits, and, I talked to a few afterward that were there. A lot of them kind of went there to see Georgia again, not so much as to see Auburn, but gave them the thought that Auburn can put together a good game plan with limited resources, and it makes them wonder, hey, when Auburn gets a few more players in, when they ratchet up their NIL, more 5-stars across the board, they might be a little bit more sportier. I think that game was always destined to be close because that's just what it is in Jordan-Hare. And I think, Kirby articulated that very well, where he's had a lot of people focus on number one and the other record of the other team, but he just stressed how really hard it is to win in the SEC. And you should be lucky to come out of any SEC road venue, especially a top 5 road venue like that in the country. That's my opinion there. And with a win, I think that's really important.
So one thing I'm glad that you brought that up, because one thing I did want to ask the both of you is Kirby brought up this past week that he feels like every SEC team should be ranked. Do y'all agree with that? If so, why or why not? Mike?
Well, Kirby's not going to say it that Vanderbilt doesn't, but I think he probably knows. He gets to play them in a couple weeks, and, just knowing Kirby, I think he would deny it, but I don't think he'll ever be done paying back Vanderbilt for not showing up in his stadium and costing his outgoing seniors a record and standing his AD up twice. I mean, Kirby's one of these guys where I think the loyalty runs deep, but he's got the memory of an elephant. I don't think he forgets, and I think that's too bad for Vanderbilt. But to your question, Kaylee, I think the point he was trying to make was, in lieu of the SEC does not look good from a ranking standpoint right now. I think
Right.
Georgia is currently the only SEC team ranked in the top 10.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Alabama at number 11. You've got Ole Miss at number 16, and that's it. Within the top 19, Missouri's 20. So on paper, the SEC looks down. And, I think, the point Kirby's trying to make is there's plenty of teams that aren't in the SEC that aren't ranked in the top 25 in the league that nobody would want to play. And I think he's right. I think the league does beat up on each other a bit. I do think this is a little bit of a down cycle, but that's predictable when you see 3 first-round quarterbacks drafted and then 2 other guys that were in the top 5 of the Heisman Trophy voting that weren't in the first 3 rounds of the draft, and Hendon Hooker and Stetson Bennett. So you 5 marquee quarterbacks left the league. There were some early season losses that have hurt the league's image. Obviously, Texas went into Tuscaloosa and beat Alabama in a high-profile game. We saw Florida State beat LSU with a dominant second half, and we saw North Carolina beat South Carolina. We saw Miami beat Texas A&M. And yet, I think the league is still good. I think time will bear out that it's very good, and I think that's what Kirby was trying to say, is that the league is still pretty good. And I think from his perspective, there's a lot of parity in the league. I think he recognizes this Georgia team isn't as dominant. He said that. He said he doesn't know how good this team is.
So, Jeff, do you agree with that? Do you think that the SEC is still as competitive as Kirby is making it out to be, or that's just a bunch of publicity to disguise the fact that maybe the Dogs aren't so as good as we have been in the past recent years?
I don't think it's kind of trickeration or anything like that. I think it's maybe him looking at the top 20 and seeing all those Pac-12 teams or Pac-2 teams, future Pac-2 teams in there, that Big 20 teams, where he knows the Dogs and he knows probably the Tigers and the Wildcats and the other Tigers and the Rebels and the other Tigers and the Gators. They've run through a lot of those Pac-12 teams, Pac-10 teams like hot knife through butter. So, I mean, like, he knows what the quality is in that league, and maybe the upper crust isn't as high as it used to be, but that middle is going to be something pretty impressive. I mean, if we're really looking at college football right now, you see Georgia's wart. We were talking about that earlier. I think Georgia's not setting the edge very well at all. I was kind of like really taken aback in Jordan-Hare when I saw Georgia had like 150 yards given up on the ground in the first half. That Georgia teams just do not do that. And I think what you're going to see in college football is you're going to have a season in which kind of plays out for, dadgummit, why don't we just have a Big 12 team playoff? Because you're going to have a lot of teams with one loss, maybe a lot of one-loss conference champions, and maybe a lot of one-loss non-conference champions. They're going to be looking outside this year, where it's not going to be such a given. I mean, there's 3 probably Big 10 teams you could say, man, I could see a case where, without getting too clever with my scheming, where they make the Final Four. The same thing for the Dogs, the same thing for maybe I would say Washington or Oregon in the other league, and then you got Texas and Oklahoma as well. I mean, I know there are going to be games that kind of decide this, but there's also going to be a lot more games that make it quite complicated.
Well, I had the pleasure of sitting next to Mike Griffith in the press box on Saturday. It was my absolute honor, and we're sitting there watching the second half. You see Brock Bowers get one ball, then you see him get the next one, and then you see him get the next one. And so I looked at him and it was like, is our contingency panic plan when all things are – I was about to say something I shouldn't say. But when things don't go as planned and we're not in the lead after halftime, is our contingency plan get the ball to Brock Bowers? Because that's the sure thing. Mike, I know you said last week on the show that you were kind of hoping that we didn't see him get the ball as much as we did because we don't want him injured later on in the season. Based on his performance this past Saturday, do you still feel that way, or have your thoughts kind of changed around that?
It's a long season. You do what you got to do to win each game, though. I mean, unfortunately, Georgia was in a position where they fell behind. As Kirby said, I mean, he'd like to see the team do a little better on first and second downs, and maybe not push it to that nth degree. You guys were in the same post game I was. I mean, Kirby looked mentally spent. Like, remember the last time he left there? I think he said something about how about them effing Dogs. He didn't have that same energy and fire after this one. I think Kirby was ready to get on the plane and take a nap on the way home, because that was a pretty exhausting was a pretty exhausting day all the way around. I mean, it was a road trip, and of course, our DawgNation team worked really hard, and the players, my gosh, those guys work even harder, and what an atmosphere that was. And you could just feel the energy in that stadium. And yes, on the one hand, you don't want to see overuse of Brock Bowers, but it was 9 catches, 157 yards, something like that. I think he had 4 of those in the fourth quarter for over 100 yards. But at the same time, we were there for a really historic performance. Yeah. I mean, that's a game a lot of people are going to remember. And, as far as oil painting moments of Brock Bowers, there's been a lot of them. But that's definitely one for the Brock Bowers highlight reel. And I feel fortunate to watch the game like that and seeing that greatness in person. I mean, this is a guy you tell your grandkids about, or your great grandkids or whomever, when we start talking about who's the greatest tight end of all time. We've all got a Brock Bowers story now. Hey, there was this game at Auburn, and they fell behind, and Kirby said Carson had been missing him open the whole game, but thank goodness he started looking back and finding him in the fourth quarter on the backside against cover 2 and
making one-handed catches.
And Brock said, hey, they throw me the ball, I got to make a play. I'm just doing my job. He's really, that's the other part of this that's fun, is that he's a very modest young man. And in fact, when I asked him about Heisman Trophy consideration, he said it's just a lot of outside noise. He said they just need to work on winning the next game. So yes, Kaylee, that's kind of a mixed answer. On the one hand, I think there's only so many hits any player's got in them, but on the other, I'm really glad I was there to see that performance, because I think it might have put him on the Heisman Trophy map for this season.
So with that said, Jeff, based on the trajectory of what it looks like Brock Bowers' season is coming to be, do you think that he's a legitimate Heisman contender?
I think he's a legitimate in-the-room contender, and I think that's where about as far as you have to go with tight ends. I mean, listen, if Brock does this every week, then he'll put up like Devonta Smith type numbers. Mm-hmm. Maybe you throw in some rushing touchdowns and that's what you do it. You got to remember that award is such a stat-driven award that it's really hard for anybody aside from a running back or a quarterback to win that award. And sometimes if you're the best player on the best team, you automatically kind of get that invitation to what used to be the Downtown Athletic Club for still the Downtown Athletic Club's award. You had me thinking there for a little bit. Kaylee, I wonder if you're any good at impressions. I wonder what the soundtrack of sitting next to Mike actually sounded like. But I want to say one thing about Bowers here. And everybody, he's great. And I don't even know if that performance or maybe what he did against Florida with the juggling catch last season with similar numbers is the all-time Brock Bowers moment yet. But for me, I like watching these athletes when things don't go right. And sometimes the TV cameras don't show that. And I remember a sequence this year where Brock Bowers had a lot of green grass in front of him, and Carson Beck threw a ball this way, and he dropped it. And I'm sure, and I've heard this, that the next week in practice, Brock tripled his efforts, jugs machine, whatever it is, to fix that. But on the way back to the huddle, Brock Bowers was literally treating his helmet like it's Mike Tyson against way back when Hitman Hearns or something like that. He was literally slapping himself, and just, I mean, he was effusive at himself, like he just dropped this simple ball. And that's when you know it's great. You got a great one right there. When, man, he does so much. And I'd hate for Georgia fans to have seen Georgia lose to Auburn and Georgia not hit the Brock panic button over and over and over to make it work. But sometimes coaches overthink themselves. They sit there and they go, let me get this great, creative, clever play. Let me get some imagination, some trickery. When really all you got to do is say, man, just get the ball to Brock. Let him break 3 tackles and get in the end zone. Sometimes it really is that easy.
So I am not good at impressions at all. Let me just state that right now. Do not ever expect an impression out of me, but I will let y'all in on a little story from Saturday of my experiences with Mike Griffith. Other than learning that Mike Griffith is probably one of the funniest people on this entire DawgNation staff, it seemed like the first half of the Auburn game kind of reflected the first half of what we were going through in that box. Like, things couldn't have gone more wrong. I mean, not even 2 minutes before kickoff, Mike Griffith's computer goes completely AWOL. Like, not dead, just done. Like, it was done. And if that would have been me in that moment, I would have gone straight into panic mode, because especially for him, somebody that's having to write articles to put out during the game, I mean, that is your primary focus right there, other than watching what's going on. And so I did what I knew to do. I offered him my computer, and I don't know if my computer was getting the same vibes from Mike's computer, or it really was just the Wi-Fi in the Auburn press box, but my computer would not hook up to the Wi-Fi. And I have to give credit to Mike for handling it as well as he did. Like, I would have pulled out all my hair before we even got to halftime. He handled that like a true professional, like Brock Bowers mentality in the second half. Like, he had a game plan. He knew what he was doing. And so I just want to give Mike a really big shout out. And then, of course, just like the second half of the UGA game, things got themselves figured out. And right after the game was over, Mike's computer magically comes back on. So, Mike, if you want to make a comment on that, you are more than welcome to. But I just had to say I was so impressed with your poise and how you handled that entire situation, because I would have gone into straight panic mode.
Well, it's one of those situations where you got to stay calm, because you got to figure it out. I mean, we had to write a lot of content. The game was playing out. Thank goodness Brandon Adams was up there, and we had a third computer.
Yes.
So
third time's the charm.
So it was a team effort, and then we were able, Kaylee, you and I, to run 100 yards. Pretty impressive to watch Kaylee run in boots across a grass field, but she did, and we ran 100 yards across, and we made it to the locker room on time for the post-game interview. So, that was a good team building experience. You got to know how to handle adversity. You got to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and you got to keep the main thing the main thing. And we were able to do that and make that Kirby Smart press conference and collect our videos and pull off a really big DawgNation team win there from Auburn. So felt like we grew from that. Like, we're better as a result of that, and I'm looking forward to the next game.
That was very inspiring. I know, right? And too, I wish that I completely forgot about full sprint, a whole 100 yards, especially with the way that our running back room has been so injured. I think if a UGA coach would have saw that, it would have been preferred walk-ons the next day for both me and Mike Griffith. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because I forgot about that. Now, this is kind of where we're going to take our halftime break right here. Jeff, I told you we would come back to this later on, talking about non-football athletes. So it doesn't have to be the greatest of all time in your mind, but just your favorites in general. Who are your 4 favorite? This is your Mount Rushmore of non-football athletes. You've got a lot of wiggle room with this one. Doesn't have to be the best on paper, but in your mind, who are those heroes that you go back to, or the people that you looked up to, or the people that you wish you could say, I wish I would have seen them during their prime? Since Jeff kind of circled around my question last week and did his own thing, we're going to let Mike go first so that Jeff has a clear representation of what the answers are supposed to look like. Mike.
Jeff is such a good sport, isn't he? You want to know why I'm smiling all the time? Because I'm on with Jeff, and he's just like the most pleasant guy ever. And
yes,
we just love Jeff. Are we talking just Georgia athletes or just athletes in general?
This is athletes in general, non-football. You can do whatever you want with this question. Okay. Non-football.
Well, it starts with Jordan. I mean, Michael Jordan to me was the ultimate competitor. I loved watching him play. I got to cover him once in person. He didn't disappoint. He hit 2 buzzer beaters in Salt Lake City to extend games into overtime. Just such a phenomenal competitor. And I know he missed a lot of shots. He talks about that in his commercial, but it just seemed like, when you played pickup with your buddies, when you'd shoot it, you'd say, Jordan, like it was going in. Like Jordan you talk about the ultimate clutch gene and the ultimate competitor, and it was Michael Jordan. And, the football thing makes it a little more challenging, right? So NBA-wise, another person that I saw play in person that I truly think was one of the most fantastic in his prime, and that was Shaquille O'Neal. For a guy not only to be that big, but the way he moved. I used to cover NASCAR, and I would always find a way to cover an Orlando Magic game when I was down in Daytona because I wanted to see Shaq in person. Because the only thing I could liken Shaq to was when you'd go to the circus and you'd see those tigers jump from one top of the ladder, small pedestal, to another. To see something that large and athletic have that much grace and coordination And Shaq in his prime was just unbelievable. I mean, the guy he could run the floor with the guards. Obviously, he was physically dominant. And beyond that, he was fun.
Mm-hmm.
Like Shaquille, you talk about bringing a smile to your face. Shaq is fun, and he was fun to watch as an athlete. Certainly fun as an interview. He's fun as a commentator. I think he's a true gift to the athletic world. I really, really love me some Shaquille O'Neal. So there's a couple basketball guys. I don't know. Can we sneak in Bo Jackson? I mean, he sort of was a football, but he played baseball. All right, that doesn't count. Baseball guys, probably, man, that's tough, but I think I would have to go with Pete Rose. The way Pete played the game was a guy that I tried to model myself after. I was a Cincinnati Reds fan. I love the head first slides. I love the grit. I love the determination. I love the way he broke up double plays. Just a winner in every respect, and take the heat off Pete. He belongs in the Hall of Fame. Just another ultimate competitor. Gritty is the word, I suppose, that comes to mind when I think about Pete Rose, and just kind of, rifling through my mind. I think of, tennis greats I kind of go through, and there's some good ones in there. Obviously, you think about, Bjorn Borg and Pete Sampras, and I think about Roger Federer. The most obvious one is probably Tiger Woods on the golf game. Wayne Gretzky, we think of the great one, the all-time leading scorer in the NHL. I think about track and field and covering the 2012 Olympics. I guess I would probably have to go with Usain Bolt as my fourth.
Now, before we let Jeff answer, I thought about putting Shaq on my list, but you're talking about Shaq as just not an athlete, but an entertainer and an interviewer. Did you know that Shaq is also a DJ? My sister has seen Shaq before, and she said it was she's been to see a lot of people, right? Like, that's her thing. Shaq, one of the best performances that she's seen of all time. So just for that, I wanted to put him on my list, but I wasn't going to. But for those of you at home who did not know, Shaq is also a DJ. What an entrepreneur. Okay, Jeff, you got it. You've had some time.
Yeah, I could have wrapped these off real quick. First of all, Kaylee is going to haunt me for forever for talking about tailgate food versus high school concession stand food or concession stand food. So if anybody just joining this program, I'm just going to give you the backstory. The backstory there is she asked a question about things you eat at a game, and I was like, tailgate food, because tailgates are amazing. That's probably the thing we don't get to do as reporters and scribes, but
it's because Jeff lives in Woodstock. He's bougie. He's not eating concession stand food.
So I like where Mike was going with a lot of those, and I'm gonna ramp up my degree of difficulty, and I'm gonna make this kind of like Survivor here.
Oh, love that.
Everybody that Mike said is off limits for my answers here. So he said a lot, and he covered a lot, man. He went to track, he went to golf. So I got some that would still adhere to that principle. Number one, probably maybe I'm going to go most dominant athlete. And you did say Tiger, so I won't say Tiger, but I'll say Mike Tyson in his prime was a buzzsaw. And I was somehow found a way when I was probably 6 years old, something like that, to find a way to find somebody who knew somebody to watch a lot of his pay-per-view fights. I actually liked watching boxing a lot. I liked watching Sugar Ray Leonard as well. But Sugar Ray Leonard, my interest in Sugar Ray Leonard led me to Mike Tyson. The second one, and this is probably from growing up as a son of the South, is Dale Murphy. That's regional bias here for me, but you do have a two-time MVP there. You do have a guy that transferred from catcher to outfield and just did things the right way. I actually learned about the Mormon faith by just reading a lot about Dale Murphy. But Dale Murphy was the kid. I wish every kid, and that's what I do with my own children right now, I wish every kid had the chance to grow up and look at somebody like an icon for his athletic ability and find out he's just a better dude off the field. Dale had this column in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution where fans would write in and just mailbags full of mail, like ask Dale Murphy. And there'd be questions like, how do I get taller? Or, how do I ask a girl out on a date? Or, how to hit the off-speed pitch? And it was just great. And he also was the guy, and talk about the best ad ever. Dale Murphy was a milk endorser. He had a milk ad. And I believe it was Kinnett milk, but like it was on the Braves programs, and he'd be drinking milk. So I'd tell my mom whenever we'd going somewhere, I was like, hey, we got to get it. That's Dale Murphy's milk. Magic Johnson, huge Magic Johnson guy. That's a guy that I think combines entertainment and athletics so very well. And I guess the last one I got to talk about to make sure I get 4. So I have Magic, I have Mike Tyson, I have Dale Murphy. I kind of also got to go. I was a big track guy, kind of like Mike was, because I knew I was a huge Olympics fan. Still am. Like the Olympics have lost about 3, 4, 5 miles off their fastball, but when it was prime Olympics, it was so good. And I remember watching Carl Lewis in '84. I think I was like 6 years old again there, but he wins 4 gold medals, and it's the long jump and it's the sprints. And then he goes in the next Olympics and repeats. Well, eventually repeats because Ben Johnson tests positive for steroids and everything else. And, you know, Carl Lewis to be the relay guy, to be the long jump guy, to be the sprinter guy, to be the 100 guy, to be the 200-meter guy. He just, for me, fit the bill as the greatest athlete on the planet. So those are my answers.
So we only missed one guy. There's only one name that has to be mentioned, and that would be Michael Phelps in terms of dominance and gold medals. He was an unbelievable monster. And I was actually covering his roommate, was a Knoxville guy, and I was working at the Knoxville newspaper when I went to the Olympics. And he kind of told the story of how he said to Jeff
I think he left
there. That's pretty good there, Jeff. I like that. Are we not supposed to see that yet? That was you gave up the skeleton, but he basically, Phelps had to refine his competitive gene. You know, he had fallen off. We'd all kind of predicted Ryan Lochte would take over the Olympics, but instead Michael Phelps had another historic performance. So I think Michael Phelps probably deserves to be in that conversation somewhere.
All right, I'm going to make mine quick so we can move on to Kentucky preview. I know Mike is going to like this one. I had Jenny Finch on my list, and for those of you who don't know, Jenny Finch is a pitcher, and all like 80 pounds of me growing up, chicken arms, chicken legs. I was a pitcher, and it did not last very long, but Jenny Finch is the first like professional softball player that I knew and I cared about. I had her glove, and I just thought I was the coolest person in the world. And so she is a softball living legend, and she also inspired me to care about softball truly, and not just as a hobby. She's the first person that made me look at it and realize, you can make a career out of this. Clearly I didn't, but she is what inspired my love and passion for softball throughout the years. So I had Jenny Finch on mine. I did have Michael Jordan, but I'm going to follow in the footsteps of Jeff, not get the same answer. I'm going to say Larry Bird instead. My prized possession that I hold so dearly, I would guard it with my life, is my Larry Bird Dream Team number 7 jersey. I've only worn it one time. And the one time I wore it out, I don't know how much liquor this person had to have in them, but they offered me $300 for the jersey off my body at that time. And I was in college, so $300 is like $300,000 in your mind at that time. But I did not sell it. It is hanging up in my closet. I will never wear it again. I will frame it at some point and put it up. He's just so entertaining.
Would you have sold it for $500?
No. Maybe once we started getting up into the thousands, maybe I would have had to call my dad first, because he got it for me for my birthday. So I feel like maybe if somebody said 1,000, that he'd been like, okay, will you give me my money back on what I spent for it, and then you can keep it. And maybe I would have, but like I said, I hold it very near and dear to my heart. Also, because of y'all may not know this about me, I really like NASCAR. I got super into NASCAR during COVID, when that was the only thing that was on TV. And my grandfather, who's definitely watching this right now, is a massive fan of NASCAR. His whole garage has posters, and he's got all the little like mini cars. And so somebody that I didn't get to live to see their prime, but I know that even their impact and their influence lasts now, is Dale Earnhardt. So there's my throw you off answer right there. I wish I would have been able to give anything to watch that with him while he was in his prime. And we hated Jeff Gordon, so I knew that growing up too. And then my last
we're gonna have to talk. We're gonna have to talk.
That's what I grew up to know. And so NASCAR is not something that gets a lot of credit, but I, through my grandfather, learned to love it, and I still have an appreciation for it now. And I think it would be really cool to cover the Daytona 500 at some point. So we're going to manifest that and throw it into the air. And then my last one is Serena Williams. I love the Williams sisters. It's hard when you have an older sibling who goes into the light first, and everybody, knows their talent that they have. It's really hard to be a second sibling, but Serena overcame that. I also love that she's a fashionista athlete too. I love watching tennis, Wimbledon, all of them. So I wanted to make sure that I had a 50-50 ratio. So I'm going to go Serena Williams for my last one. And then, all right, now let's shift to Kentucky. First thing I want to ask you guys is, it's a little out there. So Kentucky's coach, Mark Stoops, I need to pull up the exact dollar amount here. I want to say that he makes like $8.6 million a year with incentives on top of that. So it's probably a little bit more, which makes him the 9th highest paid football coach in the NCAA. Do we think that he has the best coaching position in all of college football? Because where he's coming from, I feel like he has really reasonable expectations. He can fall 2nd, 3rd, 4th in the SEC East, and like that's a good year for Kentucky in my mind. I don't want to trash them because they're undefeated heading into this game. I do have a lot of respect for him, but from a coaching standpoint, do we think that like he has got it made because he's getting paid a bunch and his expectations are still fairly reasonable versus other schools in the SEC that if you don't get an SEC championship or you don't look like you're headed that way, you're done. So I want to know what you guys think about that just based off what I have gathered. I will let Jeff start with this one.
I actually think Oregon is a great place to be because they play currently in a Cheesecake Conference, and you have the resources of not only the you hear every recruit, especially for the next maybe 4 or 5 years or so, still say that their dream school is Oregon, and their dream school was because of the Nike swoosh, because of the chrome helmets. It was because of everything. And, you know, you're Dan Lanning, and nobody's expecting Oregon to win national championships. They're just expecting them to make some noise, win 10 games, be a top 10 team. But the resources are all there. And the other thing is they can recruit California, especially when, like, USC was down, everything else like that. But then the last thing is there's never going to be a resources problem at the University of Oregon where they can get whatever they want. The facilities, I think Phil Knight is a generous donor and will continue to be a generous donor, even with his trust and everything. So especially Dan Lanning brings SEC principles to the Pac-12, which is not built on line of scrimmage. It's not built on hard rock defense. It's not built on length coming across the edges. And I think Oregon's one of those jobs that seems very, very set up for success where you don't have to win a national championship every year at Oregon.
Mike, what do you think?
Well, the question was about Mark Stoops. And
I get where Jeff was going, though, but also Dan Lanning is not paid as much as Mark Stoops.
Jeff's not going to argue. He's made his point.
I mean, the question was who's got a good gig where they don't have to win a lot and they can still get praised. And like, that's what I surmised her question to be. Like, who's got a spot where they don't have a lot of hot seat? They can win 8 or 9 games and everything will be Fonzie.
See, what you have to respect and like about Jeff is he's a very creative person, and sometimes creative people, they don't really like to stay inside the box. And thank goodness that he doesn't, or he wouldn't be the best recruiting writer in the country. And we're very fortunate to have him. And a lot of his creative pieces, whether it's on video, whether it's on his Wednesday night show, or even today, it just puts a smile on my face because he brings such a fresh and different perspective, Kaylee. That's the nice way to say he didn't answer the question. To answer the question, yes, that is probably the best job because he is the longest tenured Power 5 coach to have never won his division. And yet he's their all-time wins leader. He's had the longest tenure there because I think the point you were trying to make is that he has kept Kentucky in a comfort zone. And I haven't looked it up, but I'm guessing they've had at least 6 wins every year, between 6 and 10 wins. I think they probably finished 3rd or 4th one of those years, if not 5th, maybe his first. But what is the expectation at Kentucky, right? Win 7 or 8 games, don't embarrass us, don't get in trouble. I guess if you're competitive with Louisville, that's an annual rivalry. But yet you say that, and if Kentucky were to beat Georgia, all that money they spent would be worth it. If Kentucky were to get a win over number 1, which they haven't done since 2007, They beat a number 1 ranked LSU team in triple overtime in Lexington.
Wow.
I believe it was 43-37. This would be the biggest win in their program history. And, could that really happen? I don't know. I hear what you're saying. I thought the same thing, Kaylee, when I saw the coaches pay list come out. I mean, this is a guy that makes almost as much as Jimbo Fisher,
right,
and actually makes more than Josh Heupel or Lane Kiffin, or believe it or not, more than Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, more than James Franklin at Penn State. So I understand what you're saying. As for Dan Lanning, I think he's a fantastic coach. I think it's going to be really, really hard for Georgia fans in a couple years when he gets hired by Florida to take over the Gators program and try to return them to greatness.
I thought he was getting hired by Alabama, Mike. Where is he going to go? Is Shuma going to Alabama? Is that the way it's going?
No, I think Alabama's going to hire the Texans coach, D'Amico Ryans.
Some DawgNation hot takes.
So the other thing I think that about Stoops' money and why he makes so much is I think Kentucky's had to pay him and up him a lot to keep him there, because he's a guy that every time a job came up, they're like, hey, let's go to Stoops, because it's not only what he's done in the SEC. Remember, Mike, it wasn't so long ago that the Stoops last name was a franchise in college football coaching. It was it's a hot topic. I mean, that kind of was synonymous with success. And I think the other thing, and they've had to keep him there. I think I can only remember only one bad season, Mike, and that's 2020 during the pandemic year. I think they had a losing season that year. And then they've been around 6, 7, 8 wins every year. And that I mean, I love that stat you threw out that, hey, he's never won a thing. And look where he's at. He's almost in this coaching economy. There's no such thing as the Hall of Fame. Well, there is the Hall of Fame, but there's no such thing as the Hall of Very Good. And I think that's where Bob Stoops has resided. So he's gotten paid and re-upped when somebody had a job or somebody said, hey, let's go call Bob Stoops. And this is all puppeteer Jimmy Sexton doing all this stuff right here. But Bob Stoops is a guy that keeps getting paid, keeps getting re-upped. And that's why his contract is so good, because Kentucky wants to keep him there because they're quite happy with where he is and what he's doing. And I don't even think if he won big one year, people would be like, all right, let's build a statue of Bob Stoops. That's about it. They wouldn't say, like, get us back there each and every year.
I am sorry. I just can't get over Hall of Very Good. Like, we're going to have to do something with that on the happy hour, the Hall of Very Good. I don't even know if I would fall into that category. Maybe, like, the Hall of Better Than Mid, but not.
See, now, I think we have just stumbled upon where we put Stetson Bennett, because he doesn't qualify for the Hall of Fame because he never made All-American. And Kirby basically said this week that you don't win a national championship because of him. And yet I think he was very good. I don't think he's an all-time great. He's not a college football Hall of Famer. But I am comfortable, Jeff. I think we found our middle ground here. I am comfortable with putting Stetson Bennett in the Hall of Very Good with players like Kenny McIntosh, was in the Hall of Very Good.
Kenny's in the Hall of Good. All-time Georgia football history. Come on.
I did a story about, the greatest running back seasons, and, Kenny's 1,300 all-purpose yards last year were pretty. He was in DeAndre Swift territory, another Hall of Very Good player.
Yeah, I was thinking DeAndre Swift would be Hall of Very Good.
I'm putting him in there.
Yeah,
are you okay with Swift being in the Hall of Very Good?
I like
Jeff?
that.
Jeff's not biting on this, Kaylee. He's not. We've taken his idea.
I think he's pleading the fifth.
Listen. We all love Kenny McIntosh and what he was over the top. He was amazing. He was like the heartbeat of the Georgia team. He was always smiling. He could be a great media member one day. He's got a great story, got a great family background. But if you're ranking all-time Georgia running backs, I think there's a different category for where Swift was and maybe where McIntosh was. And listen, McIntosh, man, give him his flowers. He was great. But like when you rattle off the top 15 running backs in Georgia history, I think the name DeAndre Swift shows up a lot more than Kenny McIntosh does.
Well,
now, McIntosh might be a top 20 overall running back. But
to your point, this is where I would go with that, Jeff. Kenny is a 2-time national champion. I would tell you that Matthew Stafford is a better quarterback than Stetson Bennett. I would tell you that Jake Fromm was a better quarterback than Stetson Bennett. I would tell you that Aaron Murray was a better quarterback. I would tell you that David Green but the mailman's got the rings, just as Kenny has the rings. And Kenny didn't drop a pass his whole career. So I agree with your premise that on an individual talent basis, but were those players able to elevate? I know that when Kirby shut down the running game after Stetson almost threw a pick six at Kentucky, I know they handed the ball to Kenny. I know at Missouri when they were about to lose that game and it was 4th and 2, they didn't put it in Stetson's hand. They handed it to Kenny to win that game in the 4th quarter. I know against Georgia Tech when the offense was struggling and couldn't throw the ball in the first half, they went to Kenny. Now, Swift was fantastic, but at the end of that 2019 season, when they needed him, that shoulder wasn't there for the LSU game. He couldn't carry the ball in the bowl game. So I agree with you on an individual talent basis that there were 5, 6, 7, 8 guys off the top of my head I'd put above Kenny. But in the clutch, I'm going with the guy that never dropped a pass, that kept the perfect season intact with his inspirational performance against Missouri, just as I've got to give Stetson credit. Even though he stunk it up for 3 quarters against Alabama in 2021, he was there in the 4th quarter, and that was good enough to win the title. So that's why I put him in the Hall of Very Good over David Green and over Aaron Murray and over Jake Fromm, even though individually I think all 3 of those players were better.
Well, Mike, let me pull up these are some DeAndre Swift receipts right here.
This is what I've been waiting on this entire time that we've been doing Happy Hour for the last couple of weeks. Thank goodness. Go, Jeff, your counter.
Every time, everything you said about Kenny McIntosh and Stet and parking the passing game after a pick six, I can think of a Kentucky game where the same things could be said about Jake Fromm, where, it was that Forrest Gump type rain, and I think Jake Fromm attempts 12 passes. And DeAndre rolls for like 161, and there's the Texas A&M game. You know why DeAndre's shoulder and everything else was hurting? Is because he was carrying that team, that offense for a lot of that season in his last season at Georgia. DeAndre was a guy that had that burst, and I think the one thing about his career, and I've said this, and it's sometimes I've been following these backs for so long that they're on Georgia's radar as a sophomore, and like if they're hurt sophomore year and they miss 3 games sophomore, miss 3 games junior, miss 2 or 3 games senior year, and then they get to Georgia, and it's the same thing. Well, it's not the training method. It's not overuse. It's just sometimes those superior athletes are like a Porsche. And anybody out there that knows that, I don't drive a Porsche now. Anybody out there that has a Porsche, when that thing goes in the shop, that thing's going to be in there for about 2 weeks. And when the guy says it's in there for 5 days, it's in there 2 weeks because it takes a long time to get those parts. And that's what it is sometimes with a back. When those backs get dinged up, you can sit there and say, unfortunately, it's kind of happening a little bit with Kendall Milton, who wants to win for Georgia so badly. And he actually called his shot when he was a high school recruit. He said, we're going to Georgia not to win a natty, but to win natties. And he's already gotten that one right. But, one thing Mike stumbled on, and this is we have a social hour a lot around me and my friends, whether it's on a boat or a pool or somebody's house, is there's a way you have to differentiate these great athletes. And it is, we can have the most talented conversation, but then you got to have the greatest conversation. And for me, the greatest conversation, and this may be similar to what Mike feels right there, the great players put stuff up on banners. The great players bring home rings. And when you measure greatness, you can't say, well, he didn't have an offensive line, he didn't have receivers, he couldn't have this. The greatest guys win the big games. And that's sort of like a resume type thing where Mike kind of talked about championships for athlete A and athlete B. And that's the difference between a Stetson and a Matt Stafford and an Aaron Murray. I have this conversation a lot with Dog fans. And I find myself thinking, I do think Stetson is one of the greatest Bulldogs of all time because look at what he did. Aaron Murray had the same ability against Alabama to make those passes in 2012, to win the game, to win the SEC title game, and to take Georgia to the promised land. And he didn't do it. Stetson did do it. No matter what you say, you can say Todd Monken, you can say defense carried him. No, we remember those games. Stetson had to physically wing that ball to A.D. Mitchell. He had to physically wing that ball down the field to Karis Jackson and Ohio State in that game. Greatness is when you just have to get it done. You have to put the championship in the trophy case. You find a way to get it done. And so the greatest player in Georgia history, I always contend, is a much different conversation than the most talented or the best player in Georgia football history.
That is a great point. And the only thing I'd say is that Jake did everything he was supposed to do. If that safety doesn't bite on 2nd and 26, Jake becomes the first true freshman ever to win a national title. And I feel so bad for Jake because getting to know all these players, I can tell Georgia fans, they get to see glimpses of them on camera for 30 seconds or 45. They don't really know the person. They don't know what it's like when you run into them in public. Jake Fromm may be one of the best collegiate ambassadors I've ever run across. One of the best people, one of the best leaders, just a fantastic young man. He deserved that championship. He won that championship, and the defense let him down. And I never, ever heard Jake one time mention that. I've never heard Jake talk bad about another player. All I've heard him do is support his team. He took all the blame at every turn, even when it wasn't his fault. And he tolerated a lot of noise in his ear about how much better Justin Fields was throughout his entire career, and he never let it faze him. And even in the aftermath, he's still the same guy. So it's sad to me that Jake didn't get a championship that he deserved. And I'm not saying he carried that team, because of course he didn't. Nick Chubb and Sony Michel were fantastic. The defense was good, not great. There was a very good supporting cast. But I tell you this, I really believe this. If Jake comes back for 2020, I think you might have seen 3 titles, because you remember you were beating Alabama 24-20 in Tuscaloosa at halftime before Stetson's interceptions. I don't think you lose to Florida. I think you would have won the national title in 2020. Because it was a COVID year, Jake would have had 2 more years. Jake Fromm could have been a 3-time national champion. He would have led 2021 and 2022. You could have put him back there, and your team would have been just as good, if not better. There would have been no JT Daniels time. JT would have never transferred here. It would have been an interesting story. One of my favorite what ifs is, what if Jake would have stayed for 2020? And irony of ironies, I've reported it. I've said it. Nobody ever bites on it. Nobody ever latches onto it. I'm always amazed. The person that Jake said convinced him to go pro was none other than Peyton Manning from the Manning Academy. And I always think to myself, I wonder if Peyton, as competitive as he is, did he really think that was best for Jake to go pro? We never really talked about it. Everybody just moved on. Kirby doesn't get caught up, and Georgia fans are good. Yeah, okay, whatever. Let's go on to the next one. But to me, that's one of the greatest what ifs. And to me, I guess one of the saddest things, because I think Jake Fromm deserved a champion. So that's my little pledge there, my little sidebar.
Okay, I hate to be the one to do it, because there is nobody that has enjoyed this conversation as much as but we have to wrap up. I would definitely say, looking back on all the happy hours that we've done, I would put this particular one in the category of Hall of Fame of very good. So great job, gentlemen. As always, thank you for coming on. And of course, we are going to shout out our sponsor for the DawgNation Happy Hour, which is none other than Marlowe's Tavern. You guys already know it's every weekday from 4 to 6. And I actually took my roommate, who just celebrated a birthday, to Marlowe's Tavern for my birthday dinner to her. We sat at the bar. Bartender was super nice. We did try the Marlowe's Tropical Blue, which I'm not usually a sweet drink person, but I really, really enjoyed it. We shared some kettle chips. Y'all know I can't go away from my fish tacos. I am a creature of habit, but she did have the Nashville hot chicken sliders, and she absolutely loved them. So please check it out. Put a picture on Twitter, #DawgNation Happy Hour. I want to see all of you going to your local Marlowe's, and so we just thank them so much for allowing us to host this show in their honor every single week. And then, as always, Jeff, Mike, you two are an absolute pleasure to have on, and maybe we will continue our conversation on the Hall of Very Good. I want us to do some more with that. So thank you guys so much. But we're getting geared up for another game day between the hedges on Saturday. A big one as undefeated Kentucky comes to town. As always, enjoy today. We've got a big one on Saturday. See you then, and go Dogs.